Hi, I'm Phil Candreva. Military budgets are normally a material part of any country's national budget. In the first 2 decades of the 21st century, on average, the United States has devoted 18% of its annual national budget to the Department of Defense and 3.7% of GDP. Contrast that to 1944 during World War II, when 87% of the budget and 37% of GDP went to the military. Military spending is material to an individual nation. It also has repercussions for allies and adversaries. It signals capabilities, strengths, weaknesses, and priorities. Thus, it's a topic of considerable interest. What drives the level of military spending in a given country? Well, there's no straightforward answer to that question. There are a lot of factors that are shown to correlate with changes in defense spending. There's a lot of interaction among those variables, and the nature of those interactions vary considerably among countries and regions. But even if it's impossible to build a mathematical model, it's useful from a public policy perspective to consider the drivers of military spending in the US and other nations. An increase could signal pending hostility, but it may just as likely not. Military and diplomatic leaders need to have a nuanced perspective on changes to military expenditures. Let's look at the factors in three broad categories. The first are fiscal factors that are related to budgeting theories, national wealth, and the spending of regional powers. The second category includes domestic factors ranging from the national security philosophy of the nation's leaders to groups who influence those leaders, the attitudes of the public at large, and the presence of civil unrest. Finally, we'll look at international factors, including whether the nation is engaged in or believes it will be engaged in conflict, the effects of international defense alliances, and a link between military expenditures and international relations, including those outside military treaties. We turn first to the fiscal factors. The theory of incrementalism says that the best determinant of next year's budget is this year's budget. And we can see that military budgets in the United States do not vary much from year to year. In fact, in the 60 years from 1962 to 2022, inflation-adjusted defense budgets grew by more than 10% only 3 times, and those correspond with the early years of Vietnam and the war on terrorism. The largest decreases corresponded with the end of active combat operations or the collapse of the Soviet Union. The average and median change were less than 1%. More wealthy nations and more populated nations also tend to spend more on their militaries than less wealthy nations, but not necessarily a greater percentage of that wealth. During that same 60-year period, the GDP of the United States increased sixfold, but defense spending as a percentage of the national budget fell. The added wealth went principally to social programs, but not at the expense of defense spending, which, when measured in real dollars, was cyclical with a net upward trend. Even in third world countries, we don't see a relationship between social spending and military spending. In other words, there's not a crowding out effect. Each part of the budget moves independent of the other. Lastly, the military spending of a nation is somewhat determined by the spending of other nations in the region, but on a relative basis more than an absolute basis. So imagine a region with a dominant country that spends, say, $10 billion or 3% of its GDP per year on its military. Other nations nearby tend to also spend about 3% of GDP, but will not try to match the $10 billion, which could be 10% or more of the GDP for the non-dominant nations. When nations attempt to keep up in dollar terms, their militaries start to equalize in power, causing an arms race. But by spending in similar relative proportions, the balance of power remains stable. Research tells us this seems to be a default outcome rather than a deliberate objective. Let's now turn to domestic factors that affect changes in military expenditures. The first is the national security philosophy of decision makers. We can see this influence in the United States from the founding, when the Federalists and Anti-Federalists argued over the role of a central government, whether or not there should be a standing army, and General Washington warning of entangling alliances. Political ideologies are about the ideals and principles of societal order and the priorities of the government, driving how power should be allocated and to what ends it should be used. There are many types of political ideologies around the globe, all of which are present in the United States to one degree or another. What impact does ideology have on the allocation of resources, specifically for the military? Ted Lowy, a political scientist, saw the world of public policy in 4 dimensions: regulatory policy, distributive policy, redistributive, and constituent. He would have positioned the budget under the distributive type of policy, and notes that the political right would favor the subsidization of corporate power and capitalism to support essential government tasks such as defense. The political left would prefer public ownership of essential services with more displacement of corporate power. But neither is more pro-defense than the other. They would use different means to develop that power. Ideological differences manifest less in the top line of the defense budget than they do in things like personnel policy choices, such as women serving in combat roles or draft versus volunteer armies. This chart shows the level of defense spending in the United States adjusted for inflation, plotted against the political party of the President of the United States. And what we see is something rather interesting. That with respect to the president, from Clinton through Trump, every Republican left office with a defense budget higher than when he took office, and every Democrat left office with a lower budget. But if you go back in time to the period between Truman and George H.W. Bush, with the one exception of Ronald Reagan, every Republican left office with a smaller defense budget than when they entered office, and every Democrat increased the budget. And if you look at that cyclical pattern of spending on defense, it's not the political party of the president that tends to be driving that. It's what's going on internationally. McKinley's study of military expenditure determinants in over 100 third world countries showed that the level of military influence on the central government, such as a military-run regime, surprisingly does not result in greater military expenditures. 2 other political scientists, Whitten and Williams, challenged the cliched budgetary trade-off of guns versus butter. Their research of advanced democracies showed that both the left and right are willing to increase military spending in the face of conflict. And during peacetime, they both favor increases in defense, but for different reasons. Although right governments may be more hawkish and thus inclined to spend more on the military, left-leaning governments see the opportunity to use military spending as a way to advance domestic non-military objectives. Such welfare in disguise primarily takes the form of employment multiplier effects of government contracts. In other words, guns yield butter. Rebecca Thorpe reinforces this thought in her study of US defense spending. She discovered that 85% of counties in America receive some direct or contracted defense dollars, twice as many in the 2000s as there were in the 1980s, and further found that defense companies enjoy strong political support in areas where the military sector is crucial to the local economy. This is true regardless of the political party of the representatives. Other domestic factors include the influence of lobbyists on the elected and appointed decision makers. These may include industry and trade associations, of course, but also veterans groups, environmental groups, labor unions, and state and local governments. Those who favor our domestic form of government will be happy to know that in most democratic governments, military spending tends to be responsive to public opinion. The graph here shows the direction and magnitude of public opinion about the level of defense spending plotted against changes to the defense budget the following year. If the bar points up, public opinion favors more defense spending. The longer the bar, the stronger that support. If the bar points down, the public favors less defense spending, and again, the longer the bar, the stronger the support. Average is about -10 on this scale. The line is the changes in the defense budget the following year, because public opinion this year is going to affect next year's defense budget. And we find a very strong correlation here of positive 0.6, pretty darn high for many social science studies. McKinley also found that the level of civil unrest correlates with higher defense spending, but only in those cases where there's sustained and organized unrest, such as the presence of terrorist groups and organized crime. Finally, we look at international factors that affect the level of military expenditures. The most obvious, of course, is the presence of actual conflict or the perception of a real and present danger of conflict. Outside formal alliances, the greater the amount of private sector free trade between nations, the lower their military expenditures tend to be, and the less likely they are to fight with one another. But the greater the level of government-to-government involvement, such as arms sales and diplomatic arrangements, the higher military expenditures tend to be. One exception is when international aid is tied to a level of military spending. Some nations may limit their investments in their military in order to qualify for international aid payments. Being a member of an international defense alliance may also impact military expenditures, but the effect varies from nation to nation. Take NATO, for example. Most countries do not contribute the target goal of 2% of GDP to their militaries. So the level of pressure from the more influential states could result in an increase. Conversely, economic theory tells us that an alliance may result in substitution effects or complementary effects driving down a country's military expenditures to achieve the same level of defense. If they can rely on another nation providing a certain capability, or if they can purchase a weapon without investing in the R&D, a military capable is available at lower cost. In the extreme, this can lead to free riding. A smaller nation has little incentive to keep up with the big boys in an alliance because they know the larger powers will come to their aid. Let's look at alliances and coalitions a little bit more closely. There are three theories that help us understand the level of burden sharing within an alliance or a coalition. And a coalition is simply a temporary alliance put together for a limited purpose or a limited period of time. The economic theory of alliances relies on two key economic principles. The first is that people act in self-interested ways. Another tenet of economics is that there are different categories of goods, kind of a generic term for a benefit received, even if the good is a service or something intangible. And these goods are classified in two dimensions: excludability and rivalry. Excludability is the degree to which a good may be accessible to only a paying customer. If a restaurant were to produce a hamburger, only the person who paid for it will get it and others will be excluded. On the other hand, if someone were to put on a fireworks display, they could not exclude people within a line of sight from enjoying it too, regardless of whether they had helped pay for it. Rivalry is a function of whether one party's access to the benefit affects another party's. Most tangible goods are rivalrous. If I'm using a hammer, you need to wait. Many intangibles are also rivalrous, such as the use of a frequency on the radio spectrum. But to the beneficiary of that radio broadcast, the listener, my listening to that broadcast does not limit my neighbor's ability to listen to the same broadcast. Thus, listening to the broadcast is non-rivalrous, while the use of the radio spectrum is rivalrous. So what the theory says is that self-interested nations will view common defense as a public good, which smaller nations tending to shirk, thereby making larger nations bear a disproportionate burden. However, some coalitions and some aspects of alliances may behave as club, common, or private goods if a particular capability, for instance, is held by one nation, or a nation could benefit privately through the sale of arms to a coalition. The risk-sharing theory says that participation in an alliance brings about two types of risk. There's alliance risk. If you think of NATO and Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all, then by joining NATO, one assumes alliance risk because an attack on some other country is going to involve you, and you're going to bear a cost for that. At the same time, though, there is a reduction in risk due to the nature of the alliance that an enemy may be less likely to attack, knowing that all of these other countries are going to come to your aid. So the alliance risk has both a positive and a negative aspect to it. Similarly, there's a capability risk. This is where there's joint production of a weapon system, or a country can sell its weapons to other countries, thereby lowering the unit cost of production to themselves. And so there are some gains there in the economies of building and sustaining a military. But at the same time, there could be complications and added cost in order to make a system interoperable with one's allies, costs that wouldn't need to be borne but for the alliance. And so this risk-sharing theory of alliances says that countries are going to, again, act in a self-interested way, but these various factors and the way risks present to the individual nation will determine its willingness to participate and the extent to which it'll take on a share of the cost. Finally, there's the political and justice theory of alliances that says, yeah, okay, there's this economic theory out there, but when diplomats get together to discuss these things, they don't talk about excludability and non-rivalrous goods. They talk about what's fair. They talk about doing your part. They talk about making a difference. And so measuring some of these economic things becomes pretty difficult outside of a simulation. And countries aren't necessarily willing to share some of this information. So what we tend to rely on are things like ability to pay measures, percentages of GDP, percentage of the contribution to an event. And we pick up these much simpler, easier to understand, easier to sell domestically methods of allocating burdens. So I hope this quick video has given you some appreciation of the factors that drive a nation's military budget up or down. But I hope you also have walked away with an understanding that these factors are heavily dependent upon the idiosyncratic position of a given country, its situation domestically and internationally, as well as the interdependence among these variables and interdependence among the nations. Thank you.